I first encountered the bridge photographs by accident, tucked inside an uncatalogued folder that carried nothing more than a faded municipal stamp and a penciled inventory number. They were not dramatic images. No handwritten warnings, no sensational captions, just routine documentation. The kind engineers and surveyors produced when a structure was finished and recorded for future reference. Stone arches framed empty roads. Iron trusses cut clean lines against pale skies. Rivers moved beneath them with unremarkable patience. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Then I noticed the people. Small figures stood near the abutments, frozen mid-step or leaning against railings, their hats tilted low, their posture relaxed in the way of workers waiting for instructions. I traced the height of a man's shoulder against the stone behind him, then followed the curve of the arch overhead. The proportions did not settle easily in the mind. The opening was too tall, the rise too generous, the roadway too distant from the water below. I set the photographs beside contemporary images of the same crossings, same locations, same rivers, same stone patterns, weathered but intact. The scale had changed. Lower arches now framed traffic. Walkways had been raised. Entire courses of masonry sat hidden beneath asphalt and gravel, their presence suggested only by odd window cutouts along embankments and stairways that descended into sealed chambers. No war longer connected to anything. Captions on the originals were sparse. Dates, project numbers, initials belonging to clerks long dead. Surveyors appeared only as signatures. Archivists only as stamps pressed into paper margins. No commentary about alterations. No mention of later excavation. No explanation for why bridges once towering above open riverbanks now seemed to pressed into the earth. I measured shadows in the prints, compared railing heights to human silhouettes, counted stone blocks across parapets, and traced their courses forward in modern restorations. Nothing dramatic announced itself. What emerged instead was quieter, a sense that these structures had not been reduced by erosion or collapse, but by something added around them. Layer after layer, street after street, fill piled against stone until only part of the original form remained visible. The photographs did not accuse. They simply waited. Bridges built to span water, now partially buried by land that had not been there when the shutter clicked. And passages once open to sky, now framed by concrete ramps and utility lines. I kept returning to the same thought, though I refused to let it settle into the conclusion. If these images were accurate, and there was no obvious reason to doubt their authenticity, then the modern city had grown upward around something far larger than it currently admitted. The bridges were still standing, but something about them had been quietly taken away. The first impulse was to trust the eye. The second was to distrust it entirely. Photographs flatten distance, they distort scale, they compress depth into surfaces that can mislead even careful observers. So I stopped relying on impressions and started counting instead. Stone courses became units, railing segments became rulers, shadow lengths became angles. I traced arch curvature against surviving spans, then pulled municipal blueprints from digital vaults that still carried 19th century drafting marks, some annotated by hand, ink faded but legible. Others had been scanned decades later, stripped of marginal notes, converted into neutral diagrams that said little about how much earth now surrounded their foundations. Measurements repeated. The rise of an arch that once cleared river spray by several meters now ended barely above modern traffic. Stairways visible in early prints vanished entirely in later surveys. Load paths indicated by buttresses no longer made sense. And so, unless something substantial had been added, or engineering journals mentioned retrofits, reinforcements, drainage adjustments, they did not mention burial. Names appeared only as signatures beneath calculations, inspectors, survey departments, restoration committees. Their reports were precise in what they addressed and strangely quiet about what they did not. I recalculated spans using original scale bars, then overlaid them with present-day schematics. The difference was not decorative. It was structural. A bridge designed to rise from open banks does not slowly sink without leaving scars. Subsidence fractures stone, floodwater undermines piers. None of that appeared in the records. The foundations remained sound, the masonry intact. Only the surrounding grade had changed. By meters, I wrote the number down twice, then a third time. It refused to shrink. And once something refuses to shrink, it stops feeling like coincidence and starts demanding comparison. Once the first set of measurements settled into place, I stopped thinking in terms of a single river crossing and started pulling files from elsewhere. Different cities, different countries, different climates, the same proportions. Stone arches rose higher than surrounding topography in early photographs, only to appear partially swallowed in later decades. Stairways that once descended to open embankments now ended against retaining walls. Approach roads visible in 19th century prints had been lifted, flattened, resurfaced, until they hovered above original deck lines. Permits surfaced in municipal ledgers. Railway authorities recorded upgrades. Public works departments logged resurfacing campaigns. The language was administrative and clean. Grade adjustment, flood mitigation, expansion. What it did not explain was why the changes repeated with such uniformity across places that shared no known planning authority and no coordinated construction schedules. A bridge in one region echoed the same buried lower courses as another. Thousands of kilometers away, the distances varied, the dates clustered. I arranged images side by side. Curves matched. Pier spacing repeated. The height lost to surrounding fill differed only by fractions of a meter. Workers remained frozen in captions. Municipal stamps blurred into one another. Railway logos changed shape, but not behavior. Each institution documented what it added, not what disappeared beneath it. The accumulation felt mechanical rather than accidental. Not erosion, not collapse. Intervention, once, perhaps twice. Coincidence could survive scrutiny. By the fifth site, it began to feel procedural. By the 10th, statistical. What unsettled me was not any single alteration. It was the rhythm. A narrow window in time, a global repetition, the same kind of lowering, the same kind of concealment, the same silence about what had been displaced. The bridges no longer looked isolated. They looked synchronized, and synchronization implies planning, even when no planner is named. Once I stopped thinking in terms of repairs and started thinking in terms of accumulation, the ground itself became part of the evidence. Early photographs showed daylight beneath arches that now hovered barely above modern streets. Riverbanks once sloped gently toward open water. In current surveys, those same banks had hardened into vertical walls of poured concrete and compacted soil. Lower courses of stone vanished behind embankments. Drain openings sat halfway up pillars, disconnected from any visible runoff. Reports from planning offices described the changes with sterile efficiency. Grade raised for roadway continuity. Flood mitigation implemented. Approach stabilized. Survey departments filed diagrams that began at the new surface level, as if nothing had existed below it worth recording. The earlier elevations survived only in yellowed prints and forgotten blueprints stored in remote databases. I calculated volumes, truckloads of fill, barges of sediment, entire neighborhoods elevated meter by meter. The numbers refused to behave like incidental landscaping. To raise a road is ordinary. To raise an entire district requires coordination. Across multiple cities, the pattern repeated. Not just resurfacing, but burial. Not just one side of a river, but both. Not just the roadway, but stairwells, inspection corridors, service tunnels sealed behind brickwork that carried no plaques and no dates. What unsettled me was how casually the transformations were described, as if lowering the visible height of a structure built to dominate its surroundings required no explanation at all. At some point between the photographs and the present, the bridges stopped rising from the land. The land rose to meet them instead, and once that happens often enough, in enough places, Within the same narrow stretch of decades, renovation begins to feel like something else entirely. It begins to feel deliberate. Once the physical alterations became impossible to ignore, I turned to paper. Municipal archives usually speak in exhaustive detail. They catalog resurfacing schedules, funding approvals, procurement orders, seasonal repairs. The language is dry but dependable, a continuous thread of maintenance that follows infrastructure through decades. That thread frayed. Transport ledgers listed reinforcement projects, then jumped years ahead without acknowledging what lay between them. Engineering journals published load assessments that began at revised ground levels, as though earlier foundations had never existed. Budget summaries accounted for resurfacing asphalt, but not for the immense volumes of material required to raise entire approaches. I searched by year, by district, by river basin. The pattern repeated. Archivists surfaced only as initials in the margins of scanned documents, clerks as stamps pressed over faint ink. Revision dates appeared where original entries should have been. Footnotes pointed toward reports that no longer survived. Absence accumulated the way sediment had, quietly, methodically. What unsettled me was not that records were missing. Fires destroy archives. Floods erase libraries. Bureaucracies misfile. What unsettled me was where the silence began. Right at the moment the bridges changed. Right when lower arches vanished behind embankments and stairways terminated in sealed brick, the heavier the physical intervention became, the lighter the documentation grew. Structural reality expanded, institutional memory contracted. The imbalance did not accuse anyone. It simply refused to resolve. And the thinner the written explanations became, the heavier the stone overhead seemed to press against them. Once the records thinned out, interpretation rushed in to fill the vacuum. Official geological reports described seasonal flooding, river migration, sediment carried downstream during rare but intense storms. Charts showed deposition curves that climbed gradually, centimeter by centimeter, decade by decade. The language suggested inevitability rather than intervention. Other assessments pointed elsewhere. Abrupt surges, unmapped layers of compacted silt, buried surfaces that showed no sign of slow weathering, only compression. Surveyors noted density profiles that resisted ordinary erosion models. Municipal committees debated drainage upgrades, without addressing how entire lower courses of masonry had disappeared beneath new strata. I laid the explanations beside one another. None fully accounted for the volume. To raise a roadway by meters requires more than runoff. To entomb stairwells and seal arches demands sustained movement of material, followed by engineering work to stabilize what remains exposed. Whatever covered the bridges did not leave them. Fragile, the structures endured, reinforced, reintegrated into altered streetscapes. That sequence mattered. Burial alone cannot produce finished curbs and paved approaches. Something followed the deposition. Rebuilding, regrading, reassignment. Whether the earth arrived through catastrophe or accumulation, the result was the same. The original profile vanished. A new surface was engineered above it. Traffic resumed. Utilities were rerouted. New maps were drawn, as though the lower world had never existed. I returned to the photographs again. The arches were unchanged. Only their relationship to the ground had been rewritten, and rewriting terrain is never a passive act. I returned to the images again, this time not to what they showed, but to how they had changed. Original blast plates revealed edge details that later prints quietly abandoned, cropped margins erased, footing stones, enlargements softened vertical lines until arches felt shorter than they were. In some reprints, the horizon line rose just enough to make buried courses appear decorative rather than structural. Publishers appeared only as imprint marks, curators as catalog numbers. Restoration notes spoke of clarifying composition, of improving legibility for modern audiences. No one mentioned scale. I layered versions chronologically. Early exposures kept the full span in frame. Later editions trimmed the lower thirds. Still later, scans adjusted contrast until masonry melted into embankments that had not existed when the shutter first closed. The effect was subtle, cumulative, normalization achieved through repetition rather than decree. What resisted alteration were the originals themselves. Grain patterns remained fixed. Shadows stayed long. Human figures still stood where they always had, dwarfed by arches that refused to shrink. Those earliest photographs did not argue. They persisted, and persistence, in a record so carefully curated, began to feel like resistance. The bridges were still there. Traffic flowed across them each morning. Maintenance crews inspected joints and replaced surface stone. Municipal reports logged load tolerances, resurfacing schedules, corrosion mitigation. The structures functioned. They carried weight. They complied with contemporary codes. What they no longer carried were explanations. Original design records stopped short of describing why certain spans rose so high above riverbeds that no longer existed. Early foundation diagrams ended at layers now sealed behind compacted fill. Clearance heights exceeded modern requirements even before sediment altered surrounding terrain. Reinforcement methods appeared in 19th century drafts without the calculations that should have justified them. Engineers working today referenced retrofit dates rather than origins. Surveyors mapped present elevations rather than historical ground lines. Commuters passed beneath arches that once opened into air, unaware that entire courses of stone lay hidden below street grade. Infrastructure, I began to realize, does not require understanding to survive. It only requires use. When a bridge continues to serve its purpose, questions about its original intent become optional. Curiosity gives way to routine. Mystery becomes background. Yet every retrofitting project, every resurfacing permit, every partial excavation repeated the same silent pattern. The upper portions were preserved. The buried sections were stabilized and sealed rather than exposed. Documentation focused forward, not downward. What persists is function. What fades is rationale. And when a civilization inherits machinery it did not design, it often stops asking why the machine looks the way it does. The arches endure. The explanations do not. That imbalance began to feel less like coincidence and more like the final residue of a transition nobody recorded. By the time the investigation returned to the bridges themselves, the accumulation had become difficult to separate into categories. Photographs refused to disappear. Stone courses remained buried beneath raised streets. Engineering ledgers stopped mid-decade. Retouched reproductions softened proportions without erasing them entirely. Modern maintenance reports documented surfaces while leaving foundations untouched. Each strand could be explained in isolation. Together, they formed something heavier than coincidence. Institutions entered only as silhouettes. Archive systems, planning offices, publishing houses, heritage registries, none offered a single coherent account of transformation. Only fragments distributed across departments that no longer spoke to one another, responsibility diffused, memory segmented. I laid the materials side by side and felt the investigation tilt away from measurement and toward implication. Why did documentation thin precisely where construction intensified? Why did sediment appear everywhere yet receive no unified explanation? Why did early photographs persist while their context dissolved? Why were present-day engineers comfortable inheriting designs whose logic no longer survived in calculation sheets or correspondence? Questions surfaced only after patterns had hardened. What was altered? What was buried? What was preserved? The bridges remained operational, indifferent to interpretation. They continued to carry vehicles, water, rail, weather. Their stone endured cycles of frost and reinforcement, untouched by debate. What did not endure were narratives. They fractured into footnotes, appendices, renovation permits, catalog numbers. Stone lasted. Silence lasted longer. and standing between them was a record that no longer added up, leaving only the unsettling sense that something essential had been lost, not through destruction, but through quiet subtraction. I returned to the first photographs and resisted the urge to push them further than they would go. They remained what they had always been: routine survey images, construction documentation, ordinary records that became strange only after time rearranged the ground beneath them. The spans still rose higher than modern clearances required. The lower courses still vanished into soil that official histories treated as stable and incremental. Retouching softened outlines, but the geometry survived. Engineering archives thinned exactly where structural change accelerated. Road grades climbed without corresponding excavation reports. Entire decades compressed into footnotes. Nothing, in isolation, forced a conclusion. Together, they refused to settle. Why did bridges designed for open approaches now emerge halfway from embankments? Why did reinforcement projects preserve upper stone while sealing lower arches? Why did early photographers capture proportions that later generations seemed reluctant to frame in full? Why did municipal memory fracture into departments that could no longer reconstruct the sequence of their own alterations? The questions accumulated slowly, the way sediment does. What else had been raised? What else had been sealed? What else had become so familiar that its transformation passed beneath notice? I did not arrive at an ending. The spans did not permit one. They continued to carry traffic and water and weight, while withholding the logic that shaped them. They endured while records blurred, while photographs resisted normalization, while documentation retreated into silence. If these bridges change once without leaving a clear trail, then the larger question is not how they were altered. It is how many other structures already have been, and how often we cross them without realizing what they no longer explain.